Hello and welcome to today's live Publishing Campus online lecture, Discover How Metrics Can Boost Funding and Networking Opportunities. My name is Rachel Guest and I will be moderating this event. We will begin with a 30 to 40 minute presentation that will be followed by a question and answer session. You can send your questions at any time during the presentation using the Ask a Question button on your screen. As over 700 people have registered for this event, we won't have time today to answer every question, but we will answer a selection of the most representative one. There's also a technician on standby, and should you have any technical problems, please use the live event tech support button on your screen. Now I'd like to hand you over to your presenter, Hans Zylstra, who is Senior Marketing and Project Manager at Elsevier. Hans, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome everybody to this new session in the Elsevier Publishing Campus on discovering how metrics can boost funding and networking opportunities. What we will focus on for today are basically three main areas. One is metrics related to the funding, and all of those are also related to networking. Tools to use in a practical way. Metrics essentially are data from measurable online sources. But we always have to realize they're not a goal, they're just a tool. We have to make sure that you know the relevant metrics, because there are so many metrics around these days that you have to find your way in seeing what are the relevant metrics for me as a researcher. And that's also depending on the situation, because sometimes you are in the process before publication of an article, and then you should look at different metrics than you would do after publication of your article. And I will go into details in a minute. Always make sure that if you want to use these metrics, do have them at hand, because if they're not available, what can you do with them? Metrics can be seen from different levels. And if you look at the slide here, you see on top the institutional level, which is relevant, but mostly only relevant for research managers. So for today, I will not go into details for that one. But the other three are really important for basically all scientists. First of all, we have the journal level, and that's mostly a journal metric that's relevant in the orientation phase of your publication or of your research. The next one is the article level, which is mostly relevant from the moment your article has been published, because then you're interested in what is going on with the article that I published, but probably also how do I compare to other articles in my field. And last but not least, the personal level, and that's relevant during your whole research career, because this personal level is basically adding up all your articles during your research career with all their relevant metrics. So what do metrics do? They basically give you insights, and those insights are really something that give you the context of your research publications, because your article, your publication is always in a context. That's the science area, that's the other researchers in your field, and anything around there. It tells you something about your personal status, and how have I worked so far, and what are the metrics that give me an indication of what I achieved. What also is important is to see who are top scoring. And if you look at the example in the screen, this is an example for Altmetrics, where we list the top rated articles for a specific journal in that field with all the indications one click away. And it therefore gives you more and more insights in your network. Looking at these insights is one, but acting on these insights is two, and that's obviously the most important part of the story. Act on what you see. If we then jump over to the funding of your research, I can say a few general things on that. Obviously, it's very important that you show what you've achieved, and that comes up with good plans and obviously good people, but it's also meeting more than the standard criteria, because funding agencies and funding bodies do have their standard criteria, but that's just the bottom line. It's always good and it's always important to make sure you do more than just the standard criteria. And it starts with your CV, but it goes into your publications, your awards, and last but not least to your metrics, because those metrics give an indication how those publications are doing. And they're also giving a potential impact of your future research, because whatever happens, the data you already show give an indication what you will achieve in the near future. Funders always have this question in mind: why would tax money be spent on this research? What is a good reason to spend money on this project or on this proposal? Therefore, it's important to build up some history of data, because it really has a predictive value, and because of this predictive value of data, funders are really looking at them. And only if you make sure you have it at the right time in the right place, you can say, I've got funding. Early career researchers, so ECRs, however, do not have lots of history. So what can you do? It's important to understand which metrics are available, because only with having this insight, having this overview, you can decide on when using what metrics at what time. And because you don't have a lot of history, at least use recent history to the max, because that's what you have, that's what you can have, and especially if you compare yourself to more senior researchers, that is where you can stand out. And the recent upcoming of alternative metrics do cater for that. They are short-term data immediately coming up after your publication. Show this public reach, because next to the academic reach, which was historically very important, it's more and more important to show your public reach. And that relates back to this question that funders are asking: why are we spending tax money paid by the public, the general public, on this academic research? And build your network. It is not enough to just have knowledge about your field. It's very, very important to build up a network and therefore get noticed. Some of you may have already followed the other webinar on Get Noticed, which was recently presented by my colleague Gwen van der Heijden, and you can still find it in the recordings on the Elsevier Publishing Campus. So which tools to use? I focus on 3 levels: journal metrics, article metrics, and personal metrics. The first one, journal metrics, are important to see the context, because especially if you haven't published yet or haven't published that many articles, you have to look at the data from a more general level, and the general level in publishing is the journal. And it gives you some early indications of what are the top journals, what are the top journals in my field, and how do they compare. Next to that, we have the article level metrics, which are partly also known as alt metrics, but that's not the whole story. Alt metrics are primarily metrics derived from social media and mass media, but we also have article level metrics like usage data and the number of downloads, and things like individual citation data. I will tell you a little bit about how we deal with that specifically for Scopus. Scopus is the most comprehensive database of abstracts and indexes that is both containing all the journal articles from Elsevier, but also from all the other big publishers like Taylor & Francis, Wiley, Springer, Nature and Science. The third one worth mentioning are the personal metrics, and the personal metrics are basically the metrics that you bring together on one platform that may be a personal dashboard, and I'll tell you a bit about the personal dashboard we have developed at Elsevier, which is called Mendeley Stats. And with this personal dashboard, during your whole career, you can keep monitoring all the articles that you have published, whatever the publisher is. It doesn't necessarily need to be Elsevier. It gives you a few extra metrics, but all the publishers are covered in there. And additional to these metrics, there are some tips and tricks to use. For example, the share link, and it was also touched in the other presentation. Share links are free deep links to your article that can be used even if it is a subscription journal, 50 days for free. So make sure that if you get this share link in your mail, share them with your friends, with your peers, and anybody that should read your article. And also the consistent use of unique identifiers is important. I will mention two of these. One is ORCID, which is an abbreviation of a unique number you can give to yourself that brings all your publications ever done under one umbrella. And that makes also for publishers the sharing of metrics much more easier. So please do start using this ORCID identifier for your personal research. You can find it online by Googling it, and it's very easy to use. Next to it, there's the DOI, which stands for the Digital Object Identifier, which is the unique number for an article. And that unique number is always attached to an article you publish and is in many cases part of the URL. All the systems that make things measurable do use this URL with the DOI in it to see who is linked to it, both the author but also the publication. Very essential to use it. And last but not least, and this is a more overall reference, Crossref, an organization that is has its data free online, has a service called FundRef, where you can check funders connected to DOI. So if you know the DOI of an article, you can see via this tool what the funder for that research was. And that's obviously very helpful if you know that, for example, an article similar to your article you're writing. Starting with the journal metrics. Generally, these journal metrics are made available through so-called journal homepages via publishers. So Elsevier is a publisher, but also Springer, for example, is a publisher. And if you look at the image on the screen, you see that at Elsevier, and that's the left image, we do share three groups of journal metrics. One is about impact, one is about speed, and one is about reach. And if you look at the right image, that's an overview for a Springer journal that also has similar metric groups called speed, usage, and impact. Impact generally relates to the Thomson Reuters impact factor. Most people know that one. The SNP stands for the source normalized impact factor. That makes a journal easier comparable between different fields of research. And there's also the SJR, which is also a normalized factor, both based on Scopus. And again, this Scopus database has all the abstracts of all journals available, and therefore is a good search of research data. Speed is generally divided in two types of speed. The review speed, that is the time it takes to get a decision on acceptance or reject. And the next one is production speed. So once your article has been accepted, how long does it take to be first online and get the final paginated version? And those two steps in the process of production speed are important because once your article goes online for the first time, it gets a DOI, and that again is this digital object identifier, a unique number for your article, which makes it citable from that time, even if it is not in a final version yet. And then the final group is reach. At Elsevier, we do show for most of our journals both the global spread of authors in a journal. So if you're interested to see, for example, are there a lot of authors from the UK for the journal or a lot of authors from China, you can see it with that metric. And the other one is the global spread of downloads of articles for this journal. If you want to publish in a journal that has a specific reach either globally or in specific countries, you can see how these countries compare via a world map with indications of that. So what has happened over the last few years in a new perspective on impact metrics? Because historically you do see the focus on academic impact only. And then you're talking about things like the journal impact factor, citation counts, the H index, and the number of publications. But those are and were the traditional bibliometrics. What you've seen coming up over the last few years is that next to the academic impact, also the societal impact is becoming more and more important. So how does the academic research reach the general public? And that is measured via alternative metrics on the article level. Sometimes it's referred to as altmetrics, but as I mentioned before, that's just part of the story, because download counts and page views, for example, are not altmetrics, they are simply article level metrics. The altmetrics consist of mentions in like news reports, mass media, for example, newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Der Spiegel, the China Times, whatever there is, but also references in policy documents or mentions in social media like Twitter and Facebook, mentions in blogs, and last but not least, references in reference managers. And reference managers are, for example, Mendeley and ResearchGate. So what exactly are altmetrics? There are data from alternative sources. An alternative is alternative to the historical citation sources. They track and measure online attention to research, but there are also new ways of measuring these more non-traditional forms of impact. It's important to realize that they only measure attention, not quality, because also negative attention is attention and will be measured via altmetrics. So if you see a lot of Twitter mentions of your article, it doesn't mean they are all positive. They could also well be all negative or partly positive and partly negative. At least there are alternatives to the online use of citations, which are still important to look at because they are the academic impact. For early career researchers, altmetrics give an opportunity to measure their impact and public reach. And that is something that wasn't possible a few years ago. Ideally within a relevant context. So don't just look at altmetrics as a number or as a score. Try to look at them compared to articles of the same article type and the same age, because only then you compare apples to apples and pears to pears. And preferably even within the same science area. I'll show you an example in a minute for Scopus for that. Historically, the altmetric sources is what I mentioned: social media, Twitter, Facebook, mainstream news, blogs, peer review sites, videos, policy documents, and reference managers. And it's not only altmetric.com that provides altmetrics data. You also have Impact Story. There's another team called Plum Analytics, part of a bigger company called EBSCO, and we do have Scopus metrics within the Elsevier organization, which I show you in a minute with some more details. All of these services are for free. Generally, it's important to be visible on multiple platforms, to learn, to follow, and to interact. So make sure, especially if a young and upcoming scientist, make sure that you have an account on Twitter, Facebook, a blog preferably, have a reference manager and social platform via Mendeley, or make sure every now and then you upload a video to YouTube. Because it's important that you check who are mentioning you, because only if you check who are mentioning you or who you would like to be mentioned by, you can start interacting with them. You can start following them back. And it's mostly so if you follow them, they follow you, and the other way around. And if possible, involve your university and peers, because they're also part of your network, or at least they should be. Within all these data, within all these altmetrics, for example, it's important to look for special type of mentions, because it's obvious to look at the number of Twitter mentions, but it's not so obvious to dive in a little bit more into the details and find, for example, if your article was published and mentioned in the policy document, because they are unique, and if you have been covered there, that's an extra reason to show it to your peers and to your potential funders. So make sure that you look out for them. At Elsevier, we've recently worked together with a lot of high-level universities in the United Kingdom, like Cambridge, Oxford, University College London, and a few more, to see what are really the elements of metrics that you find important as a researcher that should be covered in metrics, and also tell us what you do not like about the current situation. And what came out of that research and those discussions with researchers at these universities is that we, first of all, should try to group these metrics a little bit more than we've done so far. And we therefore identified 4 specific groups, also called buckets. And those buckets, those 4, can be divided in 2 scholarly buckets and 2 public buckets. If we go in detail for the scholarly buckets, we have a group of scholarly activity, which give you an indication of the number of times that your article was posted in online tools that are typically used by academic scholars. And the examples there are Mendeley and Zotero. And I think a lot of altmetrics data providers would also like to show ResearchGate and LinkedIn, but these organizations do not have an API. They do not have an open data feed yet that can be used to show their impact on an aggregated level. The second group is scholarly commentary, and those are the ones that mention your article in online tools typically used by academic scholars like blogs, or a field like F1000 Prime. That's a kind of selection of specific articles that get an extra review. And they're important because that shows that they are high quality articles. The 2 public groups are one for mass media, basically newspapers and specialized publications like international scientific magazines. And the last one is the group of social activity, which is the most well-known social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. What you do see here is also the relatively well-known donut by altmetric.com with the score in it. And what we think is that altmetric.com data are very good, but we do not like is the score, because nobody can recalculate this score. This score is based on a black box algorithm. And I think that one thing in science that you would not like to see is something that comes out of a black box. So we think that altmetrics are good, but it should not be a composite metrics. It should be based on an open calculation method. And that is also an outcome of these Snowball metrics discussions. So how did we deal with it at Elsevier over the last few years? We started with altmetric.com. That, by the way, started by the end of 2011 when you and Adi won the Elsevier Grand Challenge. And with this Grand Challenge, he started his own company, altmetric.com. And we've always worked with them over time to show the early indicators of social media impact. And by March 2014, especially on our Scopus platform, we also started to share Mendeley readership statistics that give an indication of what are readers in terms of their disciplines, where are they coming from, and what type of level in science do they have. Are they a PhD, a postdoc, a student, or a professor? Just to show you a few examples of what we currently already start releasing via Scopus, which will be broadly released in July of this year. In the free zone on Scopus, Scopus as a database is a subscription, but there's a free zone within this database that shares all the metrics with scientists. So everybody can reach these metrics data, not just on an article level, but also on a journal level. And that's also something that will be released for the first time in June for journal metrics, and as of July, all the individual articles, if they have article metrics, will show this. And what you see here is a first indication with a little box showing the most important metrics for this article. This example shows you, for example, the citations, but next to it also the social media and, for example, Mendeley readers. If you drill down via a click, and that goes from this page, you will see more details. And all these details are gathered on a so-called overview page with individual tabs. And these tabs include both the citation and engagement metrics with all their highlights. And by clicking through, you can also see all the individual mentions from Twitter, from Facebook, from Mendeley, everything like that. But again, grouped in these 4 categories of altmetrics. One example, this is an example of the first tab with citations. You can play with it both in a range, and I'll show you via the cursor. Here, for example, I'm not sure if people are able to see the cursor on the right-hand side. There you can play with the date range, and if I go down a bit, you can also play with the science area. And that is foremost important if you want to compare your research within the relevant science area. And on top of that, you also see a so-called percentile. And this percentile, in this example, it's the 99th percentile. And this indicates that this particular article is in the top 1 best scoring articles in this field, compared to articles of the same age and the same article type. And that is what we mean with relevance. Relevance which we don't see in the general altmetric data. That is something we added here in the Scopus metrics, which are basically an enhanced version of altmetrics. Just a few more detailed pages, both on social activity and mass media. I come to my last part of the story, and that is the personal metrics. What we've developed at Elsevier is something in which you can monitor your article for all your individual personal articles. And the service is called Mendeley Stats, which is a free personal dashboard. But it has some extras. It doesn't only show the articles that you have written as a leading author, but also the ones that you've been involved with as a co-author. And it's basically a social platform that links all the individual Elsevier content services. For example, Scopus, Mendeley, and Science Direct. It is not necessarily so that your article has to be with Elsevier. Also your Springer, your Taylor & Francis, your Wiley or PLOS or any other publisher, all these articles will be covered as long as they have citations, because they are the generally shared data. If you look for views and counts, we can only share the ones we know of within Elsevier's journals. So that's an extra for Elsevier journal-based articles. And on top of that, but that's also not specifically necessarily with Elsevier journals, are the readers based on Mendeley. An extra dimension is the media mentions. We do have an algorithm that does cover all the newspapers and magazines that do mention scientific articles. And if your article is mentioned, you will see it back on this personal dashboard. Over time, more and more altmetrics, if they are relevant, will be added to this service, which was primarily started as a reference manager. And a reference manager is something that you would use in writing your article and is the basis of all the references underneath your article. One extra aspect of Mendeley Stats is also that it gives you suggestions of relevant articles based on the ones you've already published or you already saved because you find them interesting interesting to read. If you're interested to see it, you can see the URL here, and I will show you and share it with you later in this presentation too. Primarily, if you've registered and come up within this platform, you will see a direct indication of both the citations and the views of your articles over time on a monthly basis. If you scroll down a little bit more, you will see your individual publications and the aggregated data for this publication, these publications you've done. And this is an example of a scientist with very many publications, 542, and I can imagine that if you start, you will have a relatively low number there, but you will see it building up over time, all the time. Any detail is possible to click through for more detail. So if you see this overview with some details already on a higher level of the mass media mentioned, you can still click through to the original source. And also, if you look at, for example, the global map of readers for your article, you will be able to zoom in to see more in detail what the countries are that your readers are coming from. Next to it, to the search terms they use to land on your article, for example. I'm coming to the end of my story with this final slide on Mendeley stats. You can go to this URL, and again, this webinar is recorded, so you can see it back on the Publishing Campus recording site. You just need to register once, and if you've already registered for one of the other services, you can use the same login details, so you don't have to create an account in that case. And you can simply claim your dashboard and connect your articles to it. You can start browsing and share these data with friends and peers if necessary. So coming to some conclusion, this is the final one before the conclusion slide, is make sure you use unique identifiers. They save you time and work. They give you full credit for your research, because by using this ORCID ID, for example, you will not lose any of your articles when it comes to metrics. And it also makes your life much easier to monitor your data. It will stay with you for your entire career. It doesn't make a difference if you change jobs, or if you change field, or even if you use different name variations. This unique number will always stay and will always bring all the data together. You can use it in grant application, because also for funders, this ORCID ID is an easy way of getting a full overview of your achievements so far. And also with paper submissions, publishers do appreciate if you include the ORCID ID. So it gives individual researchers and scholars really this persistent unique identifier. Next to it, the DOI is important. The digital object identifier is a unique article number that is mostly used in URLs, for example, in press releases by a university. And that is also the reason why altmetric data providers can track and trace and therefore report on the mentions of your article in public reached newspapers, for example. Coming to the conclusions on my final slide, make sure as a researcher that you know your relevant metrics, and that depends really on your situation. Use your metrics to monitor the impact of your publication, because it's changing all the time. The more time used, the more you see in details of your metrics. And also make sure that you have access to them, because knowing them is one, but having access to them is another story. Do not forget to mention them in grant proposals, because those are these additional details that funders do look at and do appreciate. And most of all, network with the people who mention you, or at least the ones who you would like to mention you, because that is the start of a network that will be helpful in the rest of your research career. That was my final remark, and thank you very much so far. I believe there will probably be some questions coming. I think yes.
Thank you very much, Hans. We're now going to move on to the question and answer part of this lecture. Thank you to everybody who sent a question during the presentation. I've selected several which are representative of the type of questions that we've received. The majority of these have been on altmetrics. So Hans, may I ask you first, are all altmetrics services available for free?
Yes, that's a good question. Although it is not as easy as it looks like to gather all these metrics from all these different platforms in one place, all altmetrics services I know of are free. So I'm talking about altmetric.com, I'm talking about Scopus Metrics, I'm talking about Impact Story. Those three are at least for free. I'm not 100% sure for the other ones. Other questions?
Okay. Do you think that altmetrics can be easily manipulated?
Well, I think everything in life can, to a certain extent, be manipulated, even citations or anything like downloading of articles. But in the end, the scientific community also is looking at each other, and if you obviously manipulate your data, there's always a moment that you will be discovered. So technically you can always manipulate altmetrics by asking your friends to tweet or retweet as many times as possible, but in the end it should come down to honest and real interest in your research, because otherwise it simply doesn't make sense. So yes, it can be manipulated, but I think that won't be a big problem.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hans. And are non-English sources included in altmetrics?
Yes. In essence, altmetric data are not depending on the English language. For example, the Chinese platform of Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter, you may say, or other language platforms, are normally covered as long as there is an open API for taking these data into a repository. And that sometimes may be a problem, because even, for example, for Weibo, sometimes governments shut off the data streams for that, and then we can report on it, but then the report quality is not always optimal. So the answer is yes, also non-English sources are covered. It depends a bit on the availability of an API, a so-called data feed, and it also depends a bit on the quality of data we can use. But as long as they are relevant, they will be included as much as possible.
Great, thank you. And for a final question, Hans, does Scopus have a list of sources that are included?
I think you mean by sources the journal titles covered in Scopus. If that is the case, yes. And there is a link. I don't know it by heart, but what I will do is share this on the Elsevier Publishing Campus, and there you can see the list of journals covered in Scopus. What I can say, it's about 20,000 plus journals that are covered in Scopus, and as far as I know, that's the broadest coverage for any publishing platform. So if the journal you are publishing your article in is not covered there, that would be a real exception. Sometimes it is caused because the journal is very new, and therefore it doesn't have enough proof to be accepted for Scopus, but normally it should be covered there. And I share this link after this session.
Great, thank you, Hans. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much to our presenter, and thank you to everyone who's taken part in this webinar and sent their questions. If you'd like to revisit any of this material or share it with your colleagues, an archived version of the lecture will be available next week on the Publishing Campus website. at www.publishingcampus.com. I hope you found this lecture useful and that you will continue to join us for future Publishing Campus events. Goodbye.